"Will someone please explain to me," Ambassador Vex rumbled, his four-eye stalks twitching with barely concealed annoyance, "why the humans insist on bringing their guards to our most sacred council chambers without any weapons?" He paused dramatically, looking around the ornate antechamber, where several dozen representatives from across the galaxy waited for the quarterly diplomatic summit to begin. I caught his gaze and shrugged all six of my shoulders simultaneously. "Maybe they're just very confident," I offered, unable to keep the sarcasm from dripping through my translator. "Or suicidal. With humans, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference." "My name is Zara'Lux, Chief Security Analyst for the Galactic Council, and after 200 cycles observing the various species that make up our interstellar community, I thought I'd seen it all." Then the humans showed up. The human delegation stood near the refreshment station, chatting amicably among themselves. Ambassador Elena Romano, a striking female with what humans considered olive skin and dark hair, pulled back in a severe style, laughed at something her aide whispered. Behind her stood two guards, one male, one female, wearing simple black suits that seemed specifically designed not to impress. "No plasma rifles," muttered Galactic, the Vargarian representative, his leathery skin flushing purple with disapproval. "No shock batons, not even a ceremonial blade. Have they no pride?" he snorted through his nose slits, sending small puffs of yellow gas into the air. The Vargarians, like most species, considered their personal guards an extension of their status. Galactic's own security detail consisted of 8 heavily armed warriors covered in so much weaponry they could barely move without something clanking, whirring, or beeping ominously. "Perhaps," suggested Nalia Bright Scales, the elegant serpenti diplomat whose species was known for their practicality, "they conceal their weapons. An advantage of their bipedal physiology and those loose garments." I'd considered that too, but my scans had already disproven the theory. Negative. Full biometric and technological sweeps confirmed they're carrying absolutely nothing that could be classified as a weapon. No hidden compartments, no unusual energy signatures, no toxic compounds. "But they must have something," insisted Vex, his voice rising to that particular pitch that made my auditory membranes vibrate uncomfortably. "Even the Florians bring their thorned guardians, and their literal plants." As if on cue, one of the human guards, the male one, introduced earlier as Jackson Rivera, glanced our way. His eyes met mine for precisely 2.7 seconds before his lips curved upward. Not the threatening baring of teeth that many species initially mistook human smiles for, but something more knowing. He knew we were talking about them. And he seemed amused. The female guard, Naomi Chen, according to the security briefing, maintained her relaxed but vigilant stance. Her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging everything in the room with quick, efficient movements. Neither guard appeared concerned about being dramatically outgunned by every other security team in the chamber. Perhaps they believe their diplomatic immunity is protection enough, offered Jexel Morrow, the ancient quantum collective representative whose species communicated through light pulses and electronic frequencies. I snorted. Diplomatic immunity didn't save the Taurian ambassador when the Kresh decided his third heart was a delicacy they simply had to sample. "That was 700 cycles ago," protested Vex. "My point exactly," I said, watching as the human delegation began moving toward the council chamber doors. "The universe is dangerous. Everybody knows this. Everybody except, apparently, the humans." What bothered me most wasn't their lack of visible protection, it was their absolute confidence. They moved like predators, not prey, despite being objectively more fragile than half the species present. "The session's about to start," I announced, gathering my data pad. "But mark my words, there's something about those human guards we're missing. Nobody survives in this galaxy being that careless." Little did I know how right I was, and how spectacularly wrong about the reason. As the delegates filed into the grand chamber, I took my position at the security monitoring station. From here, I could observe every centimeter of the massive hexagonal room while accessing the Council's extensive database. The humans were still drawing stares, and frankly, I couldn't blame the other species for their confusion. You see, the Galactic Council wasn't formed out of some noble pursuit of peace and harmony. No. It emerged from centuries of spectacular interspecies violence that nearly wiped out 3 sentient civilizations. The Accords of Mutual Preservation which established our governing body were signed in blood. Literally, in the case of the hemoglobin-based species. Every founding member understood one fundamental truth: diplomacy works best when backed by the implicit threat of overwhelming force. Hence our unique security protocols. The Vargarians, like Toth with his small army of guards, evolved on a death world with atmospheric toxicity levels that would melt human lungs in seconds. Their guards carried specialized needlers that could pierce even Chronaxian battle hide. They considered this showing appropriate respect for a diplomatic gathering. Security status: the voice belonged to Prime Director Thun Vex, Krill Vex's broodmate and technically my boss. Standard threat assessment level yellow, I reported, gesturing at the holographic display showing a complex web of potential conflicts. The Florians and Methane Collective are still squabbling over that asteroid belt in Sector 7, but nothing that should disrupt proceedings. Thun Vex's eye stalks drooped skeptically, and the humans. Still weaponless, sir. Preposterous, he huffed, all four of his breathing sacs inflating simultaneously. Check again. I suppressed a sigh. With respect, sir, I've scanned them 17 times since their arrival. Unless they've developed technology that can fool our quantum entanglement detectors, which even the ascended hive mind hasn't managed, they are completely unarmed. Let me explain something about Council security that makes this so baffling. Each member species brings guards appropriate to their physiology and threat profile. The crystalline Tauri, who shatter when struck with sonic frequencies, employ guards with specialized dampening fields. The microscopic quantum collective exists within protective suits operated by cybernetic proxies armed with disintegration beams. Even the pacifistic Lumina, who communicate entirely through bioluminescent patterns and abhor violence, bring guards equipped with blinding pulse arrays that can temporarily incapacitate most visual systems. The Council chamber itself boasts 6 different automated defense grids, emergency atmospheric scrubbers for poison gas attacks, and gravity stabilizers to prevent anyone from gaining tactical advantages through manipulation of gravitational constants. The ceiling can deploy isolation fields around any delegation within 0.3 seconds of detecting hostile action. And here were the humans, with their soft, vulnerable bodies, bringing 2 unaugmented guards with nothing more dangerous than their bare hands. Perhaps, ventured Thun Vex, interrupting my thoughts. It's some kind of bizarre cultural statement, a protest against our militaristic approach to diplomacy. I flicked through the human cultural database. Unlikely. Humans have a long, bloody history of warfare. Their diplomatic protocols typically involve significant security measures. I paused, noting a curious historical footnote. Though interestingly, their ancient Secret Service guards were known for their hand-to-hand combat skills rather than visible weaponry. Hand-to-hand, Thun Vex's voice modulator couldn't quite capture the mixture of disbelief and disdain. Against plasma weapons and molecular disruptors. I know, sir. It doesn't make sense. On my monitor, I watched Ambassador Romano take her seat at the Council table. Her guards positioned themselves precisely 3.7 meters behind her, close enough to respond to threats, but far enough away to appear non-threatening. Their posture was relaxed yet alert, hands clasped in front of them. Most interestingly, every other security detail in the room had oriented slightly toward them, as if unconsciously identifying them as the unknown variable in an otherwise predictable equation. The humans are playing some kind of game, I murmured, more to myself than to Thun Vex. And I don't think we understand the rules. The formal meeting proceeded with the usual tedious protocols: species recognition sequences, atmospheric preference acknowledgements, and gravitational accommodation notices. I monitored the security feeds while running continuous threat assessment algorithms, a process so routine I could practically do it in hibernation mode. Then came the open discussion period. That's when things got interesting. Toth, apparently unable to contain his curiosity any longer, violated diplomatic protocol by addressing Ambassador Romano directly instead of through the Council moderator. Honored human representative, he rumbled, his translator struggling with the bass undertones of Vargarian speech. My delegation finds itself. Confused by your security arrangements, he gestured toward Rivera and Chen with 3 of his upper limbs. Your guards appear to be defenseless. Is this an insult to the Council's significance? A ripple of agreement moved through the chamber. Even species who typically remained silent during proceedings turned their sensory organs toward the human delegation. Ambassador Romano smiled, that peculiar human expression that still made some of the more primitive delegates reach for their weapons. Not at all, Representative Graktoth. We mean no disrespect. Then explain, demanded Krill Vex, his voice sacs pulsating rapidly, why you bring guards who cannot guard. Even a newly hatched Crixian knows that unarmed protectors are merely decorative obstacles. The chamber's translation system struggled to keep up with the multiple conversations suddenly breaking out. I adjusted the sensitivity on my monitoring equipment, curious about the human response. Our security protocols reflect our approach to interspecies diplomacy, Romano replied smoothly. We believe that bringing heavily armed personnel into diplomatic negotiations creates an atmosphere of distrust. Distrust, the word came from 7 different translation devices simultaneously. I winced as my audio sensors peaked. Ambassador Nalia's bright scales slithered forward slightly, her scales shifting from diplomatic green to confused yellow. With respect, Ambassador Romano, distrust is the foundation of effective diplomacy. One must assume the possibility of betrayal to properly safeguard against it. Romano nodded respectfully. A logical position, Ambassador Bright Scales. However, humans have found that visible displays of weapons often escalate situations that might otherwise be resolved peacefully. But what happens, asked the Quantum Collective's representative, their voice a synthesized hum from their translation device, when peaceful resolution fails? When negotiation collapses and violence erupts, your guards will be eliminated in 3.72 seconds according to our combat simulations. I noticed something then, a fleeting micro-expression that passed between Rivera and Chen. Was it amusement? We appreciate your concern, Romano said, but I assure you, Security Officer Rivera and Security Officer Chen are fully capable of performing their protective duties. Without disintegration beams? Without molecular disruptors? Without even a simple plasma cutter? Krill Vex's disbelief caused his speech sacs to inflate so dramatically I worried he might float away. Romano's expression remained diplomatically neutral. We find conventional weapons unnecessary for our security needs in this context. Unnecessary, Graktoth's translator squealed with the intensity of his response. Do you consider our council chambers so secure, or do you believe your frail species so naturally formidable that weapons would be redundant? That's when Rivera spoke for the first time, his voice calm and measured. Sir, with respect, it's not the weapons that make the guard effective. The chamber fell silent, all attention suddenly fixed on the previously silent human. Then what is, asked Bright Scales, her scales now pulsing with curious purple. Rivera smiled, not the diplomatic smile of Ambassador Romano, but something altogether different. Something that, despite all my years studying xenopsychology, sent an instinctive chill through my central nervous cluster. I suppose, he said quietly, you'll know when you need to know. Rivera's cryptic response hung in the air, like a peculiar Earth concept I'd once studied called foreshadowing. The council members exchanged glances, some confused, others offended, but the meeting grudgingly moved forward to address trade disputes between the Florians and the Methane Collective. I returned my attention to the security monitors, but found myself repeatedly drawn to the human guards. They hadn't moved, hadn't changed posture, yet somehow seemed more present, more alert, though I couldn't identify any specific change in their behavior. The warning indicators flashed on my console approximately 47 minutes later. Unusual energy signature detected, Section 12B. I reported immediately to Thun Vex, who had been half-dozing beside me. Quantum fluctuations consistent with unauthorized teleportation. Impossible, he sputtered, instantly alert. The chamber is shielded against. The explosion cut him off mid-sentence, rocking the entire council chamber. Not a traditional explosive, those would have been detected instantly, but a gravimetric pulse that momentarily increased local gravity by factor 10, sending delegates crashing to the floor, or, in the case of the gas-based Methane Collective, compressing their containment fields dangerously. All through the smoke and confusion, 6 figures materialized at equidistant points around the chamber. Humanoid in general shape, but with distinctive bony ridge patterns that identified them instantly. Kavarth raiders, I hissed, already activating emergency protocols. How did they bypass the shields? The Kavarth were notorious mercenaries, banned from council space for atrocities committed during the border conflicts. Their presence here, in the most secure location in the galaxy, was nothing short of catastrophic. Delegates of the Galactic Council boomed the largest Kavarth, his voice amplified to painful levels. "Your security has failed. Your guards are neutralized. You will transfer all command codes to our control or face execution." I glanced at my monitor in horror. The Kvarth weren't bluffing somehow. They'd activated a targeted electromagnetic pulse that had disabled most of the automated security systems and the powered weapons carried by many of the guards. The Vargarian security detail lay unconscious, likely hit with targeted neurotoxins. The Crystal and Tori guards had been shattered by precisely calibrated sonic bursts. This was a meticulously planned attack that had circumvented billions of credits worth of security measures. The council chamber descended into chaos. Some delegates dove under the central table. Others froze in terror. The Florians began rapidly reproducing, their stress response causing them to release spores that would grow into new defensive saplings useless in the short term, but a biological imperative they couldn't override. "Transfer the codes now," the Kvarth leader demanded, raising a wicked-looking disruptor rifle and aiming it at Prime Director Thun Vex. "Or watch your leadership die one by one." My hands flew across the console, attempting to reactivate emergency systems, but the override codes weren't responding. "We're locked out," I whispered to Thun Vex. "Backup systems are responding at 12% capacity. Security teams from outside the chamber will take at least 7 minutes to breach the doors." 7 minutes, Thun Vex groaned. "We'll all be dead in 2. That's when I noticed something odd. The human delegation hadn't joined the panic. Ambassador Romano remained seated, her posture tense but controlled, and her guards. Her guards were exchanging glances, having some silent communication I couldn't interpret. One of the Kvarth approached Romano, weapon trained on her head. "You, human, you will instruct your primitive species representatives to comply with our demands." Romano looked up at the mercenary, her expression unnervingly calm. "I don't think that will be necessary." The Kvarth laughed, a harsh sound like stones grinding together. "Your species is known for its delusional confidence. Perhaps a demonstration is required." He swung his weapon toward Rivera, who stood perfectly still, hands still clasped in front of him. "Your unarmed guard dies first." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Romano said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, despite its moderate volume. "You threaten me." The Kvarth's ridges flushed crimson with rage. "With what? Your weaponless protectors, your primitive technology." Rivera spoke then, his voice calm and almost sympathetic. "She's not threatening you. She's warning you." The Kvarth leader snarled and fired his disruptor directly at Rivera's chest. What happened next occurred so quickly that even the recording devices had difficulty capturing it at standard frame rates. I had to slow the footage down to 1/4 speed during the subsequent investigation. Rivera moved. "And everything changed. Have you ever seen a Threll beast hunt? They're magnificent predators from the CD system, quick, efficient, and utterly lethal. I once witnessed a Threll beast take down prey 3 times its size without a sound." The way Rivera moved reminded me of that, a blur of precise, economical motion with absolutely no wasted energy. The disruptor beam never reached him. Somehow, he had shifted 1.7 meters to the left, while simultaneously executing a twisting maneuver that brought his right hand into contact with the Kvarth's weapon arm. There was a crack, not from the weapon discharging, but from the sound of the mercenary's arm breaking in 3 places. Before the Kvarth could even register pain, Rivera had relieved him of his weapon, disabled it with a quick manipulation of its power source, and delivered a strike to the mercenary's central nerve cluster that dropped him unconscious to the floor. 5 seconds. The entire sequence took 5 seconds. The room froze in collective shock. Even the other Kvarth raiders paused, their faceted eyes blinking rapidly as they processed what they'd just witnessed. That moment of hesitation was all Officer Chen needed. While Rivera had been neutralizing the first threat, Chen had moved not toward Ambassador Romano as protection protocols would suggest, but toward the nearest cluster of vulnerable delegates. The Tory representative and 2 Florian saplings found themselves suddenly shielded by her body. "Kill them all," roared another Kvarth, raising his weapon. What happened next defied conventional combat physics. Chen dropped low, scooped up a fragment of shattered Tory guard crystal, and flicked her wrist. The crystal shard embedded itself precisely in the optical receptor of the Kvarth's targeting system. His shot went wide, hitting the ceiling instead of the delegates. Rivera was already moving again, crossing the chamber at a speed that even the recording devices struggled to track properly. He didn't attack the armed mercenaries directly. Instead, he targeted their weapons with uncanny precision. A strike here to disable a power coupling. A twist there to misalign a targeting array. Each movement neutralized another lethal device without actually firing it. "By the void, what are they?" shrieked Krill Vex from where he cowered beneath the council table. I had no answer. My species prides itself on observational accuracy, but what I was witnessing contradicted everything I knew about human physical capabilities. 2K Varth converged on Chen, clearly recognizing her as the greater immediate threat to their operation. They activated short-range plasma blades, nasty weapons designed to slice through most known body armors. Chen smiled. Not the diplomatic smile of Ambassador Romano. Not the cold smile of Rivera before the attack. This was something else entirely, an expression that made my primary spine tingle with ancestral warning signals. "Really?" "Knives," she sounded almost disappointed. "Let me show you how it's done." What followed was a demonstration of close-quarters combat so sophisticated it bordered on artistic expression. Chen moved between the two attackers, somehow always being exactly where their blades weren't. She used their momentum against them, redirecting their attacks so that the mercenaries nearly struck each other multiple times. Then she went offensive. I've studied 27 distinct martial combat systems from across the galaxy. What Chen demonstrated incorporated elements of at least 12 of them, seamlessly blended with techniques I'd never seen before. She struck pressure points I didn't even know existed on K-Varth physiology. She executed joint manipulations that shouldn't work on their triple-hinged limbs, yet somehow did. One moment, she was engaged with two armed opponents. The next, those opponents were on the floor, their own plasma blades deactivated and neatly placed on the council table. On the other side of the chamber, Rivera had single-handedly neutralized the remaining 3K Varth. He hadn't killed any of them, though I was increasingly certain he could have, but had instead rendered them completely immobile through some combination of strikes to nerve clusters and joint manipulations that bordered on anatomical impossibility. The entire attack, from initial explosion to final neutralization, had lasted 103 seconds. Ambassador Romano hadn't even stood up from her seat. Silence enveloped the chamber, broken only by the groans of the subdued K-Varth and the high-pitched whine of a damaged translation device. "What are they?" Thun Vex whispered beside me, his voice sax deflated in shock. The answer came from Nalia Brightscales, whose species possessed ancestral memories stretching back millennia. Her scales had shifted to a pale white, a color I'd never seen on a Serpenti before. "They're humans," she said, her voice carrying a note of reverence that her translator struggled to convey. "Not just any humans. Those are what they call their special forces, living weapons trained since adolescence in every form of combat known to their kind." Rivera calmly straightened his suit jacket and resumed his position behind Ambassador Romano's chair. Chen did the same, not a hair out of place despite her exertions. Neither seemed particularly winded or concerned. "Now you understand," Ambassador Romano said into the stunned silence, "why we don't need to bring weapons to diplomatic functions. We bring the people who make the weapons unnecessary." I stared at my monitoring console, where the biometric readings for both human guards displayed heart rates and respiration patterns consistent with someone taking a leisurely stroll, not someone who had just neutralized 6 of the galaxy's most dangerous mercenaries. "They're not guards with no weapons," I realized aloud. "They are the weapons." The council chambers remained uncharacteristically quiet as maintenance drones cleared away debris and medical teams tended to injured delegates. The K-Varth raiders had been secured in quantum-locked restraints, finally functioning after emergency repairs, and transported to high security holding cells. "How did they penetrate our defenses?" demanded Thun Vex, pacing back and forth in the security center where an emergency session of the security committee had convened. The teleportation shields were at maximum capacity. The weapons scanners were fully operational. I reviewed the preliminary analysis on my datapad. It appears they used a previously unknown quantum tunneling technique that briefly phased them slightly out of our dimension, just enough to bypass the shields without triggering alarms. I paused, noting a particularly troubling detail, and they had inside help. Someone provided them with our security algorithms. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. The idea of a traitor within the council's ranks was almost as shocking as the attack itself. "Find them," Krill Vex commanded, his voice sax pulsing with rage. "Find them and expose them to hard vacuum." I was about to respond when the door slid open and Ambassador Romano entered, followed by her 2 guards. The room immediately fell silent. Ambassador Thune Vex acknowledged stiffly. "This is a closed security meeting." "I'm aware," Romano replied. "Officer Rivera has information that may be relevant to your investigation." All eyes turned to the human guard, who stepped forward with the same calm confidence he'd displayed throughout the attack. The leader's neural implant contained a security bypass algorithm, Rivera stated. "I extracted its data core before you took them into custody." He placed a small, crystalline chip on the table. "This should help you identify who provided it." "You extracted its data core?" Bright Scales questioned, her scales shifting to a curious blue. "When exactly did you find time to perform technological extraction during hand-to-hand combat?" Rivera's lips twitched in what I was learning to recognize as suppressed amusement. "Multitasking is part of our training, Ambassador." I took the chip, noting that it had been expertly removed without damaging any of its delicate components, a procedure that typically required specialized tools and a sterile environment. "Thank you," I said, genuinely impressed. "This will significantly accelerate our investigation." Grak Toth, who had been uncharacteristically silent, suddenly leaned forward. "I must know, how many of your kind can do what we witnessed today?" Ambassador Romano exchanged glances with her guards before answering. "Let's just say that Officers Rivera and Chen represent a standard capability set for diplomatic security personnel. Our military specialists possess additional skills." The implication hung in the air like a gravitational distortion. If these were their diplomatic guards, what were their actual warriors capable of? "I believe," said Zell Morrow of the Quantum Collective, their lights pulsing in what I recognized as their version of thoughtful consideration, "that we owe the human delegation our gratitude. Without their intervention, this attack could have resulted in significant casualties." Murmurs of agreement echoed around the room. "Perhaps," suggested Bright Scales, her scales now shimmering with diplomatic green again, "we should reconsider our perspective on security protocols. It seems visible weaponry is not always indicative of effective protection." Indeed, I found myself saying, perhaps instead of questioning why the humans don't arm their guards, we should question why the rest of us need to. Rivera and Chen maintained their professional composure, but I caught the briefest exchange of glances between them, a micro-expression of satisfied vindication. As the meeting continued with discussions of enhanced security measures and investigation procedures, I couldn't help but notice how the other council members now regarded the human delegation. The dismissive curiosity had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of respect, caution, and in some cases, barely disguised apprehension. The humans hadn't just saved the council today. They had fundamentally changed how they were perceived within galactic politics. And they'd done it without firing a single shot. 3 standard cycles passed before things returned to normal at the Galactic Council headquarters, if you could call it normal. The investigation had uncovered a minor diplomatic attach from the Proxen Confederation, who had provided the Kavarth with security codes in exchange for rare genetic modifications. Security protocols had been completely overhauled. And I had been promoted to Chief of Interspecies Security Assessment, tasked with implementing lessons learned from the attack. Lessons that, if I'm being honest, mostly involved studying humans. "Security report is 7721 ready for review," Chief Zara'Lux announced, my assistant, as I settled into my new office overlooking the council plaza. "Thank you, Vril," I replied, activating the holographic display. The report was actually a compilation of all available data on human combat capabilities, assembled from historical records, observation, and most valuably the footage from the council chamber attack. I'd watched that footage exactly 73 times now, and still found new details with each viewing. What made humans so different? This question had consumed my research for weeks. The answer, it seemed, wasn't simple. Physiologically, they were unexceptional. Average strength to mass ratio, unremarkable sensory capabilities, no natural weaponry or defensive adaptations. Their skin could be penetrated by even primitive projectiles. Their internal organs were vulnerable and poorly protected. They required constant hydration and regular caloric intake. On paper, they should be easy prey for half the predatory species in Council space. But humans, I was learning, didn't play by conventional evolutionary rules. "You're watching it again," the voice belonged to Nalia Bright Scales, who had entered my office silently, a serpentine trait that still startled me occasionally. "Study of excellence is never wasted time," I replied, freezing the footage on a frame showing Chen in mid-motion, her body positioned in a way that defied several principles of physics. "Besides, it's my job now." "And have you reached any conclusions?" Bright Scales slithered closer, her scales shifting to curious blue. I gestured to my notes. Humans should not be underestimated, but more importantly, they should not be understood through conventional analytical frameworks. Meaning that while most species evolve specialized physical capabilities to ensure survival, humans evolved something else entirely: adaptability. I pulled up a series of comparative charts. "Look at this. Their muscles can be trained to perform tasks they weren't originally designed for. Their neural pathways can be rewired through practice. They can literally reshape their own bodies and minds through deliberate, systematic effort. Like their guards," Bright Scales observed. "Exactly. Rivera and Chen weren't born with those capabilities. They built them, meticulously, over years of training." I shook my head in amazement. "Can you imagine? Most species spend millions of years evolving specialized traits. Humans just decide to develop new ones within a single lifetime." Bright Scales' scales rippled with thoughtful purple. "Perhaps that explains their rapid expansion through their region of space. They don't wait for evolution, they accelerate it through technology and training." "And through something else," I added, pulling up psychological profiles: determination, persistence. They have this extraordinary capacity to envision a future state and then systematically work toward it, regardless of how impossible it initially seems. I had to admire that quality. My own species tended toward careful analysis and risk mitigation. Humans embraced challenge with an almost reckless enthusiasm. "The Security Council meets tomorrow to vote on the new interspecies protection protocols," Bright Scales reminded me. "I assume you'll recommend changes based on your findings." "Substantial ones," I confirmed, starting with our approach to human integration into Council operations. The door chimed, announcing another visitor. Ambassador Romano entered, accompanied by Officer Chen. Rivera, I noted, was absent. "Ambassador, Officer Chen," I greeted them. "Thank you for coming." "Your message said it was important," Romano replied, taking the offered seat while Chen assumed her usual position slightly behind and to the right. "It is. The Council is revising its security protocols following the attack." I straightened my posture, all 6 shoulders aligned formally. "We would like to request human advisors to train a new class of Council security personnel." Romano's expression revealed nothing, but I caught the momentary widening of Chen's eyes. "That's an unprecedented request," the ambassador noted carefully. "These are unprecedented times," I replied. "The K-Varth attack exposed critical vulnerabilities in our defense systems, vulnerabilities that human techniques could help address. And the Council approved this request unanimously." "Not unanimously," no, I admitted. Some delegations expressed concerns about increasing human influence within Council security infrastructure. Romano nodded understanding. "And yet you're making the request anyway." "The galaxy is changing, Ambassador. New threats emerge constantly. Old defenses prove inadequate. We must adapt or risk obsolescence." I gestured toward Chen. "Your people have mastered the art of adaptation. We would be fools not to learn from you." For the first time since I'd met her, Officer Chen smiled openly, not the predatory expression from the battle, but something more genuine. "Speaking as someone who spent 15 years training to become what I am," she said, "I should warn you our methods aren't easy." "Few worthwhile things are," I replied. As they left to consider the proposal, I turned back to the frozen image on my display, that impossible moment when 2 unarmed humans stood against overwhelming odds and prevailed. Perhaps that was humanity's true place in the galaxy, not just as another species at the Council table, but as teachers who could show the rest of us that our limits existed primarily in our minds. And that the most powerful weapon in the universe wasn't a disruptor rifle or plasma cannon. It was the relentless human spirit, wrapped in skin fragile enough to be pierced by a thorn.